Welcome to Relative Mentality. My name is Jack.
And I'm Joe.
I know if you were here last time, we were talking about grief, and now we're going to do a little bit more of a deep dive into like the clinical side of it. We're still not here to be therapists. We are here to be family, but we are going to go a little deep diving into it.
Buzzwords. The same ones we pull out with our family because we're like, have you processed that?
No, the answer is no every time. No. Alrighty. Giving the language on grief and loss.
Exactly. Yes. I think there's a lot of preconceptions and misconceptions about what grief and loss are and what they look like. And so I'm really excited actually today to talk about the language, to talk about what is grief really, and to talk about the sort of types of grief there are. Because when we say grief, I think everybody's automatic is like somebody died, somebody passed away. And so now we are grieving the loss of a human life, which fair, definitely something to grieve. But it's not just about death of even a person, right? It could also be about the death or loss of like a pet. It could be about the loss of someone who is maybe not died, but is no longer with you for whatever reason. So maybe they moved away, maybe our relationship ended for whatever reason. Maybe there's a different reason why we are just no longer in contact with that person and therefore have had the loss and are grieving as well.
It's funny you mentioned that as well because it's like I'm also thinking about, something that we talked about where it is, I have a hard time relating to sometimes grief and death. And so it's like there have been people in my life who are going through something. And so I am trying to be there while they grieve. There's like almost secondhand grief because you don't want to see the person you love in pain. And yet
Yeah.
here they are. And so I'm almost grieving them, grieving someone else, which seems like a weird thing, but that's definitely something that I've experienced.
And that can happen with grief, and it's something we also talk about in like trauma. So there's secondhand grief or trauma, but also vicarious trauma, which is like indirect exposure to an event or to a loss, but that you've heard a firsthand account of. So someone who might work in mental health or the medical field or something like that, having to hear that story, or even as you're saying, like a friend going through something, having to do their own processing and talk through those things, that can also take a toll on you. So yeah, it doesn't always have to be just, I know a person and their passing made me feel this way. And we can also look at that too. Like there's also those parasocial relationships where we lose someone who was famous. Queen Elizabeth died. That was something that a lot of British people felt very intensely, right? The monarch that had been there their entire lives, always a fixture in their lives, always someone that was sort of important to them as part of their identity. So there's so many different forms of death and loss, and that's not even all of it. Like that's not even all the grief things that we can grieve. I mean, there's also trauma. Since we're sort of talking about vicarious trauma, just trauma in general can be something that causes us to grieve because maybe we're grieving the loss of our life we had before the trauma. We're grieving the loss of the idea of who we were going to be before the trauma. Say you get into a car accident and now you can no longer play a sport you played and we're planning to like go professional playing or go to college playing. That's going to change significantly how your future looks and your ideas about how your future is going to look. So that can also cause grief. We have to grieve for the loss of that idea. And it's the same with change too. Like I said this a lot after the last election, the 2024 election, I'll be specific, but that, there were a lot of people who didn't know, like really having complicated feelings and didn't know what or why. And it was like, bro, that's grief. That is grief for what you thought your future would look like, grief for the changes that you were hoping to see, the changes you're now scared you're going to see. All of that is you grieving the loss of your ideal. The change was the loss.
Yeah, so like what I mentioned in the last episode in relation to the election, that then put everything that I wanted in relation to having a kid has now kind of
Mm.
shifted everything. And so, yeah, like it's like there was a future and the future still might be there, but it looks different now. And so having that grief, I'm like, yep, nope, I exactly know precisely what you're talking about. And I hate that I do, but I do.
Well, and that's also kind of goes into like the idea of anticipatory grief. Not only are you sort of maybe grieving for this idea you had of the future, but you're having grief for losses your children might have that have not happened yet. Or just even like us being, again, if we're saying like politically, like really stressed about something that's happened politically, and we're like the potential consequences of a bill or a law or something like that, and we can start to grieve it before we fully lost the right to do whatever the thing was, or the bill has completely gone into action or something like that. So we can also see things in our future that are going to maybe mean change, that are we know are going to be difficult, and having anticipatory grief about that, which can be really confusing because you're like, it hasn't even happened yet. Why am I already starting to feel like I've lost something I've never even had? But
Well,
it's
and there
again that idea for you. Go ahead.
Oh, and it's one of those things too where it's they're definitely, and I know we're going to get a little bit further into it when we like talk about it later, but it's like why grieve over something, getting that response, or even my own mental brain saying, why are you grieving about something that doesn't exist? There are so many other problems in the world. Like this is a
Mm,
non-issue. And so trying to balance that, yes, I know that it's silly isn't the right necessarily adjective because then that diminishes and invalidates my feelings, but it's one of those things that like trying to explain that grief to someone who it's like, well, nobody fucking died. Like these things aren't
yeah.
real. You're imagining it. Literally, it's an imaginative thing that you're grieving. And it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
but it's still impactful. And so that's tricky.
Right. It's kind of the difference between something that's irrational and something that's rational. Just because the thought or grief or whatever is about something that's irrational, quote unquote, that doesn't mean it's not valid. It means, okay, maybe it's not fully based in reality as we perceive it as a collective, as a society, right? But in your head, it does feel that real, right? Other people might not be able to perceive it as that. And we might be able to say, come on, what's the point? Like, come on. But that doesn't make it any less real in your head. So that's when a fear, an anxiety, the grief is what we would call irrational, but that doesn't invalidate it.
That's good to know. It's like to hear that. Can you say that again? Because that's a fucking banger. Like, can we roll that back? That's great. No, really, can you
Yeah,
say it again? Because that was,
no,
I need to like
absolutely.
feel that.
I need to
Like,
feel
can
it.
you?
No, but so yes, rational means something that we can all look at as the larger society, as a group of people, and say, yes, that tree is about to fall. We should move. That is rational. But irrational is something that is still just as real to you and feels just as real, even if it is about just your perception. And it doesn't mean it's not valid. Just because it's not, again, quote unquote, real, doesn't mean it's not a valid fear or a valid feeling. Because you'll hear me talk about this a lot, but like brains are, I always say, brains are stupid. Brains are stupid and complicated, and it doesn't always make sense. So if we only look at this is something that's totally rational and makes sense to our larger understanding of people, then like 90% of what people feel that stresses them out or is difficult for them would be considered not valid. And that's bullshit. Your feelings, whether they're extreme or stunted or whatever, they're your feelings and they are valid. So if you are grieving something and people around you are like, huh, that doesn't, I guess they have the right to that opinion. You also have the right to want to like, spat gum.
Hey,
But
they have the right to be wrong. Like that's
they have the right to be wrong. But again, it's something that as long as it is real for us in our brains and in our souls, then it is valid.
like I know this isn't supposed to be therapy, but sometimes it definitely feels like it.
That honestly sort of talks about another point I wanted to get to, which is the stigma, which
Mhm.
is people not validating your grief. And there's lots of different reasons why people might not validate it. Some of it might be like cultural. Again, another thing you'll hear us talk about a lot is the sort of idea of like pull yourself up by your bootstraps and manage your emotions on your own, cross your legs, dot your I's, and never let them see you cry, sort of thing. And so that can be something that is invalidating to each of us when it comes to our grief, or it might be, maybe not just like Midwest Western lady, but maybe it's like a religious thing or
Yeah.
whatever sort of societal cultural thing is telling you like either you're not supposed to be grieving or you're grieving too much.
Yeah, thinking about when you mentioned religion, like there's like the dichotomy of grieving, but then also depending on what you believe, it's like, oh, well, they're in a better place. And I'm like, I love that for you. That works for you. Girl, I am grieving over here. I don't know where the fuck this person goes, but either way, they're not here anymore. And I can't be with them. And that sucks. I'm not trying to invalidate how other people are grieving and how they're finding acceptance in death, but it's just like, just because that works for you doesn't mean it works for me. And I think that works culturally as well in some degree. Like, I would do my best to never tell anyone how to grieve or how to, react and feel about certain things. One thing that I've worked very hard on for myself and others is emotions are valid. No matter what it is, even if it's irrational or whatever, they're still valid. They're still happening. It's okay. But also, I'm like, don't put that cultural thing onto me. Like, I'm happy it worked for you, but it might not work for me.
That makes me think too about like sometimes we'll compare our grief or just a lot of things with our mental health, but today we're talking about grief. Compare our grief to someone else. So losing our pet, for instance, if we compare that to someone who's living in Ukraine during wartime, it's easy to say, well, my grief for my pet isn't valid because one, it was an animal, and two, I'm not living through a war. I'm living in a peaceful place and I have all of this privilege of living in a place where there's not war and where I'm safe and where I don't have those issues. And so sometimes we can discount our own grief because of that, which recognizing your privilege so important. But again, it doesn't mean we have to discount or invalidate the things that we are feeling. The nature of the loss matters too, because like you're saying, if it's a pet, if it's an idea, it's going to be harder for people to understand. Or maybe it's like your really toxic ex and people are going to be like, why are you grieving that person? Or just anyone who maybe wasn't a good person, or maybe the person you're grieving died from something self-inflicted or had an overdose. So like people's judgment of the person who has passed or judgment about the nature of the loss can also affect their ability to validate your grief and your loss.
Oh, yeah. As you're talking about it, it sounds like everything to some degree is all tied up in cultural or societal expectations
Yeah.
because there's the aspect of a lot of people who are very cold and heartless with those that are struggling with substance abuse. And especially in regards to people, they have no idea. They just hear in the news, they hear, oh, this person died. And it's like, I have heard from people I know say, well, good riddance. And I'm like, that person was a child. That person was potentially a mother and whatever. And they went through these things in their lives. Had you made different choices, you could have easily been in that position as well. A loss of life is a loss of life. Call me a bleeding heart if you want, but it's still one of those things where I'm like, just because the death wasn't what, is old age or whatever, it wasn't a murder, it was, either an overdose or a suicide or whatever. There's a lot of, it feels like societal negativity around that.
That's what makes our mental health so complicated too, right? Is that we can live inside our own brains, we have our own perception, we live in our own reality, but we live in a society. And so there is no parts of our life that is not in some way touched by what our larger culture or societal ideals are. It can get you in these ways where what you are doing, how you're doing it, how you're feeling doesn't align with how you're supposed to. And that in and of itself can be very invalidating and makes a lot of people not be able to process these emotions, but kind of can cause spirals and other negative effects from it because they're trying so hard to make it make sense within the good people are good and we feel bad about them, bad people are bad and we don't feel good about them, or this is something that we agree is difficult for people and this is something that only you are finding difficult.
Yes, kind of piggybacking off of that is societally where it's like grieving and then the world keeps moving, and it's how do I validate that grief through this, that, the other? And then sometimes it's like, okay, well, it's been a month and you've been sad for a month. So, suck it up, buttercup. It's like, let's move on. You have bills to pay.
Like, how do you balance those two dichotomous pieces?
Right. And I saw like the internet is a horrible place, but it's also a great place and sometimes. And there was a phrase I saw in relation to grief that said, grief is love with nowhere to go. And that hit hard because I find that so much to be true. I had all this love for this person who is no longer with me. There's no timeline for that. And there shouldn't have to be, because on top of it too, it's not a linear or even exponential acceptance and moving on. It will hit you out of the blue. Obviously, when it initially happens, you're in the thick of it. It sucks. Everything is gray. And then eventually you work through your emotions of it. You work through the acceptance of it all. You go through all the stages of grief. And for the most part, you're okay. And then a song will come on the radio or a smell will happen. And then you're just like, oh, fuck. I even have that, as silly as it sounds, with our grandmother. There'll be every now and again, and say this however you want in relation to the paranormal or what have you, but the drink that she would always drink, I think it's a 7 and 7 or something like that. I will smell it every now and again. It's one of those things. I have no reason to. I'm not making alcoholic beverages. I'm not doing anything like that. I'm literally cleaning my office and I get like that smell in my head and I just think about her for a second and it just sucks. And she is a perfect example for me on missing her and grieving her because she passed and what I knew of her, but also grieving the future that I could have had with her. And me having been an adult, I want to say like a year or two ago, I had a dream about her and I called my mom and I asked her, I said, do you think grandma would like me? Like, as I am today, do you think she would like me? And she's like, grandma would have loved you. And that almost made it worse because I'm like, fuck, like if I've even come into my own and I'll never get to experience the things that like the older cousins got to experience with grandma and things of that nature. Like I'll never, to me, she was just kind of a grumpier old woman because I'm pretty sure by the time she got to us as cousins, she was done having grandkids. She's just like, watch Jeopardy, eat your pizza, and be okay. Like that's
yeah, she had lived through like 40, 50 years of straight, just there's always kids, whether they were her kids and then her grandkids. So I think there was a bit of that where she was like, you know what? Y'all deal with it.
110%.
I don't have the energy to fight about it. Let your mom do that fight. I'm chill.
And that kind of brings up an interesting point too with like reactions behaviorally. Like obviously you're gonna be sad, cry, but then on top of it, like once you get to a certain point, there's gonna be jokes about it and things like that. But then you have, especially with our grandmother, who we have so many family members, so many. And I think all of us, for the most part, are quite fine. It's been a minute since grandma has passed, but at certain points, people are going to be grieving at different levels where some people will be like, okay, I'm still in the thick of being sad. I'm now at the ability where I can talk about her, or I'm at the ability where I can make jokes about like things of her passing or of times with her. And it's like some people might not be there yet, and obviously grandma's different, but like just in life, there's somebody close that passes, people are going to grieve in different phases and it's going to take certain timelines, but it's not going to be the same for everybody.
Yeah.
And so then, somebody could be easily pissed off and be like, that's not funny. Literally, it's been a year or it's been 6 months. And it's like, well, XYZ person would not want me to be fucking moping around. So I'm going to try to remember them, but also move on a little bit and make jokes because that's what they would want. And if you're not there, that's just also fine. That should be fair.
And I think that's also just like part of how we grew up a little bit is comedy as a cell. So I definitely think it's very natural for us to sort of be goofy about it or whatever, as I said in the last episode, my mom's been gone a few days over a year. And I cannot tell you how many, not like dead mom jokes, but like, well, the only person who would know is my mom and she's dead. So I guess we're never going to find out how that memory really was, sort of thing, That is so much a part of who we are, but like not all people are like that. Not all people use comedy as a salve the way we've just always been taught to since we were very young. I think people get caught in the like Kubler-Ross stages of grief. So there's like denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And people really get caught in the idea of like, that's what that has to look like. That's what the grief process has to look like. And, you know, very wonderful of Kubler-Ross to make this thing. It was supposed to be very helpful, and in some ways it is. But I think now it's sort of put grief into a box that it's supposed to look like that. And one, you might not feel all of these things. And even if you do feel these things, they might not happen in that really tidy order. Grief is a tricky bitch. It's very complicated, and we can't foresee a linear progression of what our grief is going to look like because we can't know until we live through it. And each grief is different. How I grieve the loss of our grandmother, very different from how I feel about the loss of my mother because of where I was in life, because of who they were to me. Like there are so many things that sort of go along with it. So many different reactions or symptoms that we can sort of see in people who are grieving. And you were saying sort of the behavioral ones, like how do we sort of address it? How do we speak about it? I mean, it can also just be not wanting to do stuff, not wanting to go places, not having that desire, maybe not wanting to do that sport anymore, not wanting to do that activity you did with them all the time because it was something really special. I always encourage someone to like try to come back to it eventually, but it's got to look however it's got to look for you, right? It can change who you are. And I think about, I know someone who lost their son and basically was sort of like, I just don't give a fuck anymore. Like, I'm not going out of my way to do stuff for people the way I used to. I'm not prioritizing other people over me. I'm not going to acquiesce to people just because I don't want to make anyone upset. I'm going to do what I got to do for me and let go of all of those sort of behaviors and restrictions I used to put on myself. And so, yeah, it can be behavioral, it can be physical, like, well, crying. Hello. That's probably the biggest physical thing. But even that, like, not everyone cries like that. Not
Yeah.
everyone's a crying and an emotional person like that. But like physical, like we can get headaches, we can have other pains. You know, our body and our mind are connected. So if we're going through emotional strain because we've lost someone, that can affect the way our own bodies heal themselves, the way that we sleep, the way our emotions are. Are we more sensitive than we were before? Are we more irritable than we were before? Are we more closed off than we were before, or like stunted in some of our emotions? And it can also affect the way we interact with people. Are we still the happy-go-lucky person? Good example when we talk about the social aspect is a lot of marriages, if there is the loss of a child through whatever means, that usually breaks a marriage. We see that in the majority of marriages do not survive the loss of a child. And it's not even because they're blaming each other or mad at each other, but just because of the way the family unit was so indelibly changed and the stress and pressure that builds between spouses after the loss of a child, especially if there's like a long illness going before it or something like that. So it can totally change our social relationships. I should say also, all these things don't have to be negative. I think I've been saying it from a very like, here's all the bad things that can happen to you while you're grieving, but it doesn't have to be negative. There is a lot of like space for growth or improvement. I certainly have talked to my brothers more in the past year than probably in the past 5 or 10 years because yes, there were things we were having to plan and figure out with each other, but also just we're being more intentional about trying to check in with each other and trying to, you know, we don't have our mom to bridge the gap between us. So having to bridge that gap sort of on our own. And even like I said, that person, her son died and she's like, I don't give any fucks. Like, yeah, there's a negative aspect of that, but there's also a positive where she's like not putting herself in terrible situations anymore that are so stressful and overwhelming to her. There can be a bit of both that come with it. I think we're trained to look for really obvious signs, crying, depression, not eating as much, hiding in a dark room, being very upset and irritable with people. But there are also ways that loss can sort of challenge us to reevaluate who we want to be and where we want to go forward from this moment.
So, all this to say, there really is no definitive, this is how you grieve. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with how you choose to. Obviously, there are caveats. If you start drinking heavily or something like that, then, definitely listen to the people around you. But there is no definitive timeline. And it's also understood that there are going to be times where you think you're fully over this grief and then it hits you like a wave. And I know from my perspective, my brain's going to say, leave it alone. It's been years. No, it's okay. In that moment, that wave of grief is okay because then that means that it still means something to you. And that's what's important.
And I think people really get stuck in what grief is supposed to look like. And as you said, there are ways that maybe you're harming yourself that we can sort of definitively say, not a good way to process your grief.
Right.
Right? When we're thinking about healthy and safe ways to express your grief, there is an abundance of ways that that is going to look, and each person is going to look differently. And as I said before, each situation is going to look differently. So, really challenging ourselves to go into grief with an open mind for ourselves, giving ourselves the grace and space to be able to feel that grief and process it. And also keeping that in mind when we're looking to other people and hearing them say, here's a struggle I'm going through, here's the grief I'm going through, that it might not look the way it looks for you. So giving them that grace and space as well to say, hey, go through it the way you have to go through it because we are all different. Grief is hard and life is hard, but talking about mental health shouldn't be. And that's why we're here.